We're joined by Anil and Richard. Anil's a professor in planetary computing, and Richard, professor of machine learning and planetary institute for weather prediction. So we'll soon open out into a panel discussion, but people may have questions directly to Millie after that very inspiring keynote.
Yeah, my name is John Suckling. I'm from the Department of Psychiatry. I'm also the chair of the University's Research Ethics Committee, who are currently having a look at some of the geoengineering techniques and the research that's happening inside the university to undertake some pilot studies. And it's really about that I wanted to ask my question. So there may come a time where geoengineering suddenly starts to become a possibility, and governments look to that rather than doing the right thing. I just wondered, Millie, whether you could give us a commentary on how fit for purpose these models are at the moment to be able to tell us what the effects of geoengineering might be. In other words, how accurate are these models in giving us predictions of the future?
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting question, and something I am absolutely not the expert to answer, but something I have been thinking about a fair bit as someone who's interested in like international cooperation and its impacts in the environmental domain. Geoengineering is like a very hot topic. It really does necessitate clear cooperation, but like you're saying, there's a huge implication to like models that are not fully scoped in terms of like actually understanding the potential impacts of these processes. And again, I don't do modeling of geoengineering. So I'm probably not the person. I don't know, Anil or Richard? No.
Well, there was one thing when I first got into the field of conservation that came out, which was we were really into, as computer scientists, planting robots to make trees grow. And then one of our colleagues in the Cambridge Conservation Initiative said, well, if your house is on fire, you probably wouldn't call in a decorator. You would put the fire out. And so a lot of old growth nature is hundreds of years old. It's in ecologically and paleoclimatically very, very stable regions. And so we are cutting those down at a dramatic pace. And so the big danger at a high level of geoengineering is that it removes focus from nature preservation, which is ever more fragmented and ever more under danger. So once you put that aside, there's a second danger, which is one of leakage. So if for example, we heard from Millie's talk about the EU restoration laws. These are great, but then if they reduce the production of agriculture in Europe, then the demand has not dropped. And so that's typically coming from the global south or from other areas that are resulting in tropical forest cut downs. And so we're seeing again and again that more and more policy is focusing on restoration and geoengineering as the answer, when we're not putting enough focus on simply preserving what is left and fragmented. So that's my top level concern around geoengineering.
We haven't answered your question, John, but we've agreed it's an important question. Yeah. Other questions for Millie directly? I've got, yes, we've got, yes, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. My name is Benazir. I'm studying MPhil in conservation leadership. I'm from Kyrgyzstan, and my question is, it sounds like a lot of the things that you were talking about is like all around like Western-based systems of thinking and like knowledge systems, right? So are you taking into consideration indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, and how people steward their own land? Because you might use those models, but then those models might be leading to creation of protected areas, which can lead to more displacement, and that's going to affect local communities on the ground. So do you take that into your modeling and decision making as well?
Yeah, that's a really fantastic question. I'm going to give like two parts to the answer. The first is in the context of the data justice stuff, and I'm part of a working group that is a mix of indigenous scholars and folks that have been like trained in Western systems, really thinking about, this whole pipeline of like data to decisions, and how do we balance data sovereignty and sovereignty of land and decision making with sort of the huge amounts of investment that are coming from these global policies. And so how can you both include indigenous communities as like some of the main stewards of biodiversity globally, while also like respecting sovereignty and privacy and like other ways of thinking that don't necessarily like fit into our reductionist like data structures and monitoring structures at the like global like convention sort of scale. To your point about like the decision strategy sort of stuff, also a really, really interesting question. So some of that work in the US is oftentimes like prioritizing land that's specifically in like the decision space of the US like federal government. And so that would like not include indigenous lands in the US. And so often you'll do the spatial allocation problem with areas like locked in or out of the solution space. And so like tribal lands are often like considered separate and managed by tribal communities. And so yeah, it's a bit of like a distinct space and problem. Though there is some interesting work, again, I'm like speaking to the US context because that's what I know best, where protected areas that are like specifically managed by indigenous communities are like coming into play. Of course, that's changing with like our change administration, but there was recently a national marine sanctuary that was established on the California coast. That's the first like indigenous-led marine sanctuary, which is a really exciting step in the right direction for like a community that has like displaced huge numbers of people and has like a really dark history of effectively genocide. Yeah.
I think that's such an interesting question. I mean, do you have a response to what you've heard? I mean, does that, you know, do you have other ideas of approaches that might?
I don't know if I have ideas. I'm still learning all about this, right? But the US, it's a very context-specific country, and like even the existing protected areas and territories, there probably is a lot of history there that might not been captured by the data sets available right now. So that's, once again, everything has to be context specific. And then with the global targets, like 30 by 30, right? So it's global targets, but then if you look at European countries that have overseas territories and their national strategies include those territories as part of their targets, 30 by 30. But then, like, how do you balance conservation with development? You know, are there people included in that decision making in those plans that are made? I mean, here, you know. So, and then to your point is like you do restoration here in Europe, but then it spills over to countries, developing countries in terms of like agriculture, or if there are countries now trying to transfer to green energy or like clean energy, like using nuclear powers, for example, but then that increases uranium mining in countries like mine, for example. And then that's like, we have issues with tailings, radiation, and it's like, it's a whole chain of reaction, which is such a like large-scale systematic issue. Like, I'm learning about this as I go, and I'm honestly have no answers, because yeah, I don't know if it was helpful, but thank you.
I think that deserves a round of applause because it was such an eloquently put problem statement. Thank you.
I was going to turn the tables on you, Anil, because and maybe you could take a moment to introduce some of the work you've been doing and why these kinds of questions really matter to what you are trying to achieve.
That's right. A lot of this comes down to trying to kind of form causal factors where we can calculate the global effects of something and then figure out, well, what is happening at a hyperlocal level? So we built loads of global maps on, you know, biodiversity and individual things down to species levels. But then these, as we saw in Millie's talk, the top level global things don't translate down to what do we do in this street, because there's a huge amount of context there. And so the other big data set that is kind of an elephant in the room is the literature. So we've been gathering 100 million papers from the world, open and closed access, using the Cambridge ability to, you know, have subscriptions. And it is shocking how badly represented local and non-English languages are in general. And then when you get into indigenous knowledges, and you know, I'm from half Indian, half Irish, so the Indian languages themselves are very, very underrepresented, and the same is true elsewhere. And so there's not, but it's also not just an availability gap. It's a methodological gap, because a lot of this is oral traditions, there's knowledge kind of from land stewardship and ownership. And so we have to get multimodal, not only in our AI models, but also in our interpretation or our capture of this data, so that we don't just take the written form, but we also take some other way of getting this data. But of course, then the bigger problem is, how do we make sure there's an equitable data capture there? So we don't just want the North to be grabbing this data, training these models, and then mining this for information. And I think it's one of the biggest unsolved problems, that we don't really know how to get an equitable transfer back of value to the people that would give us this knowledge in the first place. So these are all open problems.
Questions to Millie or and then I'm going to ask my question.
Hi, I'm Marla. I'm from the Institute of Computing for Climate Science. So you touched on something in your talk, Millie, that strikes a chord with me and I struggle with often, which was that we will continue to collect data. And I was just wondering how you, because sometimes I feel like we're just chronicling our own demise, right? Like, and so I was just curious how you justify that. And if you were in control of all the research funds in the world, would you continue to collect data, or would you do something else?
I'd vote for you.
No, I mean, that is the question, right? And it's not only like a binary of like, do we collect data or not, but like where and how much, and can we actually meaningfully calculate the value of new information, particularly in these like complex decision spaces. So like, does collection of information like actually change the decision that we need to make or the intervention that we need to take, or do we more or less know what we need to do and we're just not doing it? It's like an issue of like societal transformation. And I think that is like a really great question. And honestly, I like tend towards the side of like, we're not using the information that we do have. And also I recognize that the information that we do have is incredibly biased along like a number of dimensions. And so we need to kind of like weigh also that issue and the potential like propagation of the biases. And so, yeah, tough question. That was a cop-out answer, but I think it's like an interesting discussion really to be having as a community.
That was actually along the lines of my question to you. But so to press you further, so if we're not, does it make sense to be ever more sophisticated in how we collect more data that won't be used? It sounds like it doesn't make sense. So what do we do? I mean, I don't know. It's that is the question. So how can? No, that was my version. So what can we do additionally? I mean, what actively, in terms of research, in terms of how what can we actively do differently?
I mean, I think that there's layers to this, and I'm sure, Anil, you also have some responses to this.
And Rich too. We're not going to let him off.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a component of it that like data collection can also be like quite efficient. It doesn't necessarily need to be this like incredibly resource intensive thing. And there's loads of people working on like really efficient technologies to monitor, especially like ecosystem change, but also like global changes. And so that's like one component of it. It's like, can we do it more efficiently with less resources? I think like if we can understand our like end goals and where we actually are lacking information for either evaluating interventions or like making strategic interventions, then like presumably we can work our way backwards and decide exactly what information we need. I think the problem with that is that like we don't always have full knowledge of what decisions we're going to have to make in the future. And there's a lot of examples of where like data that was collected for other purposes has been incredibly helpful at giving us insights into like future decisions or trends for something that doesn't even strike us as an issue right now, but might strike us as an issue in a decade. And so I think there is quite a danger to being like too end decision focused in our data collection, that there is a lot of value in these long-term monitoring programs that exists across large landscapes and might seem in the context of a global crisis to be a bit like, do we actually need all of this data, but have kind of had an incredible amount of value. And so it's hard to really quantify sometimes. Yeah.
And Rich, do you want to again introduce yourself
Yeah,
and connect to that question?
Yeah, I was sort of holding off because I'm from a slightly different field, though very much adjacent to what these guys are working on. So I'm particularly interested in weather forecasting and more broadly forecasting across the Earth system on multiple timescales, so like going beyond weather eventually to climate, and developing AI-based approaches to doing this. And as sure many of you know, the current sort of decades-old approach to weather forecasting and indeed climate modeling is to build very detailed physical models and simulate them on computers at enormous expense. And so you can run these things in the global north, and the big systems are all developed in the global north by large teams of people. They actually don't work that well in the global south, not least because there's not much data there, but also because the techniques we develop are implicitly optimized to Europe and America. So what we've been doing is like reimagining the way that AI forecasting or forecasting can be done using AI models. And sort of earlier this year, we released one of our systems in this space, which is literally 10,000 times faster than any either AI-based system currently, so all the systems from DeepMind, say. It's going to be 10,000 times cheaper than that. It can run on a desktop computer, and you can fine-tune it to problems of interest. And we did particular case studies in places like West Africa, where like current numerical weather prediction doesn't work very well. And this thing is much better. It's much better than the best European systems and the American systems, and it works on a desktop computer. And so we're taking that to the next stage. We're working with the Gates Foundation and trying to take this out to Senegal and Ghana. And so one of my reactions to the earlier question back there is, now we can really work with the universities there and the local Met agencies to allow them to train and run and develop their own models and incorporate their own, local information, their local data. We don't need some extractive model where they're sending, data out of country, and we're training stuff, on the west coast of the States or in London, and then, serving them a model that's developed there. They can actually take ownership of these systems. And data is absolutely central in this. So there's hardly any observational data, as you well know, Marla, over Africa. And I think one of the great opportunities in this space is to use smart innovations on the machine learning side and the remote sensing side. For instance, active learning to tell us where we need new stations, and putting out stations temporarily so that we can then learn a surrogate based on satellite data to predict what that weather station would have told us if it could have been run there the whole time, and then train AI models on that new data, which is derived from remote sensing data. This is called like virtual weather stations. So tricks like that, give me a lot of optimism in this space, but there are enormous challenges too.
Presumably, just to answer back to that question, presumably you don't have the trouble of people not using more accurate weather prediction, because the immediate uses, they don't get to some of these big system level challenges, but presumably there's lots of demand for.
Yeah, for us it's really easy. Like you can predict the weather tomorrow, and you can check whether that's right or wrong. Yeah. So yeah, and people want, if you're a farmer or you're a small business and you're worried about floods, they want to know.
Sorry, this is more at the scale of climate than weather, this question, but I'm just curious about other types of data source, which, maybe they're looking back at historical records, so taking tree rings, lake sediments, so these other types of data, and how much that can be used in a way to kind of rebuild like a history of what was there before, even if there's not been this ongoing kind of longitudinal data collection.
Everybody wants to come in on that.
But Millie first.
Go Millie, Anil, Rich.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's also one that's really relevant to the biodiversity domain. I think there's a lot of investment, or like proposed investment, in increasing the digitization of historic records, which again are also like largely artifacts of colonial science, and still hold a large amount of knowledge about like long histories of biodiversity change and impacts of climate and things like this.
And it's important to realize how little data we have about the long arc of history. So we're currently digitizing all of the insects in the Zoology Museum. Kew Gardens is digitizing all the herbarium samples and so on, because it gives us hundreds of years worth of data points where we might only have well, certainly from satellites, we only have about 8 years or so of really accurate kind of high-resolution synthetic aperture data and so on. So when you put all these together, though, I just wanted to quickly go back to Marla's thing about, are we chronicling our own demise, right? Because it's really important that we figure out what an optimistic and achievable kind of view on all of this is. Conservation is not just about chronicling a slow decline. It's about trying to figure out where are we heading in the future and what is a sustainable kind of end game here. So imagine 50 years from now, we've got a reasonable hypothesis that we can eradicate extreme poverty, infant mortality is dropping steadily, we will stabilize the world's population at around 10 to 14 billion people, and we will stabilize urban land use at about 8% of the world's surface. These are reasonable hypotheses, right? The politics to get there are very complex, but we know what the end game is. And all the conservation is trying to figure out, until we get there, we've got a whole bunch of nature disappearing. So how do we optimize for preserving the unique high species diversity areas which absolutely should not disappear? About 4% of the world's land surface has 2/3 of the world's species diversity, usually in the equatorial ring or on the tropical south. So if we can just figure out an actionable strategy not to save these forever, but just for the next few decades, and then have a negotiated process, with the indigenous populations there to make sure that their land is recognized as being of intrinsically irreplaceable value, that's an achievable goal. And that's really where we want to go from predicting the weather tomorrow to predicting what is the world's land use 20 or 30 years from now that is an equitable future that we can all believe in. So I am optimistic. It's going to be complicated, but it's not impossible.
Other questions? I mean, we haven't had any from the gallery. There must be some good questions from up there. You've got this height.
We can throw this like halfway up.
We'll come to the gallery next.
Thanks. Hi, Loic Lanong. I'm a researcher in Cambridge working on environmental sustainability of computing. So particularly interested with the last part of your talk, and great to see the complexity. I'm particularly interested in how to embed environmental sustainability in how we design AI, what AI we design at all, and how we design it, so quite early on in the process. And it's particularly tricky in fields where there are clear, tangible benefits, being like medical research, healthcare, or biodiversity, sustainability, climate. So in your fields, I'm curious to see how you think we should, or whether we should include it at all. But if you think we should include it, how can we embed these concerns early on to, as you were saying, make sure we don't do more damage than we're doing good, basically. But how to do it in practice, because that, I mean, as you know, that's tricky. It's easy to see the benefits. It's really hard to decide whether we should build it beforehand.
Can we start with Rich and work?
Yeah, I mean, maybe in my area, it's there's an easy argument to make, which is what there is a supercomputer running there, and it would be great if we could get off our addiction to the supercomputer and place it with an AI model. So even though the AI models are expensive-ish to train in comparison to the current compute budgets, I mean, these budgets are literally billions of dollars, a year, which is going on running these systems, and so there is an opportunity to allow this to be sort of more affordable, which is quite different from AI applications in other spaces. But I think in general the great cost of AI models is skewed by a lot of the LLM work. So if you look at even the biggest weather foundation models, it's probably true of remote sensing too. Look how costly they are to train. If you do them right, these are at least 2 or maybe 3 orders of magnitude cheaper than training a chat GPT, or 4 orders of magnitude cheaper. So. And you're starting to see like academic groups in this space, if you know what you're doing, you can actually train big models relatively cheaply on relatively limited uses. So I think I'm sort of more optimistic than your question might suggest, at least in this space.
I think that openness is actually the really, really important point here, because as long as we have open data and the ability to reproduce and build on each other's work and learn, then the asymptotic cost of that training is really massively amortized as well. I agree with Richard that LLMs skew everything hugely. So our foundation model using satellite data is just trained on 4 machines in the course of weeks. So it really is relatively cheap compared to the enormous kind of pre-trained models we have. But my real concern now is essentially capture of up-and-coming data sources by just a few organizations. And we absolutely have to make sure that doesn't happen. So in biodiversity especially, what's been happening in the US in the last few months has put my group in emergency mode, because we've been downloading data sets that are just disappearing because entire departments are being shut down, right? There's no backups, nothing. And the question really isn't what is happening in one country. The question really is, how have we got ourselves in a situation where all of this data that goes back decades in some cases is being held by a single steward in the global north? And that is not a resilient place to be. So moving forward, I think our posture should be, when we're training these models, also think about where did the data come from? Is it open? Is there an equitable place to kind of store that data and make sure that we can perhaps help to replicate it elsewhere and just make ourselves a little bit resilient against any one organization being in charge of all of this stuff?
I don't have too much to build on that. I mean, I think that's such a good point, but I do think that there's a lot of open questions about how do we build these resilient systems and how do we trade off potential with like resilience and efficiency. Because I think there can be cases where it's like duplication of storage and otherwise. Though again, a lot of the applications, at least that I work in, are relatively small compared to like kind of societal perceptions of AI impacts. A lot of people are working with really small models in the scheme of things.
Maybe I could follow up with the risk of giving a rather bloated answer, but the sorts of stuff Anil talked about is really worrying. So NOAA is removing its data sets that it serves to the whole of humanity. The ECMWF estimate that when that data goes down and they can't use it anymore, and that they're the best sort of weather forecasters in the world, that will put the system back 2 years, not having access to that. Remarkably, China has been completely open with its satellite data for weather, and we, all the best systems like incorporate data from Chinese satellites, and you can see themselves positioning to take over the mantle from the States, which is an interesting dynamic there. And I think we all need to think about data, like you were saying, right now. And our group is considering, launching satellites. Satellites are cheap to build, cheap to launch, relatively speaking. And if they're going to get, taken out offline because either the governments change administration or because the tech company that's maybe running the satellites has decided that you guys can't have access to, there's going to be a massive problem. And in general, in this space, it's really complicated. Like the tech companies, for instance, are a massive force for good, have been. But they're also, for want of a better word, a bit lumbering, and can make mistakes just because of business decisions, like they want to redeploy the teams to work on large language models because there's more money to be made there or some other area. And you see them going in and courting sort of governments, like the governments in Senegal and Ghana, for instance, and saying, why are you running a Met agency? Why don't you, buy your services from Google? And Google is branding itself as the best operational weather forecasters in the world. Not without reason. They're really, really good. But then what happens 2 years down the line when Google decides weather prediction doesn't make it enough money, or maybe we'll, multiply the cost by a factor of 10 or something like that, and this becomes a real issue. And there was an issue in Argentina fairly recently where Google's Flood Hub, which is an amazing system, predicted there would be a flood at a particular location, and the local Argentinian Met agencies predicted there would be a flood, but in a different location. But because Google's reach is so huge, the people listened to the Google prediction, and it was wrong. So the question is, what's the accountability there? How's that going to work in the future? And so in many of these cases, there aren't like clear lines of accountability either. So I'm sort of worried about this, and we all need to be thinking sort of proactively about it. And that's where academia really has a role to play, I think, and national institutes and some sort of critical thinking about what's happening.
Great, thank you. Any other questions, particularly on this question of like open data and how we get the infrastructure that's going to work? Yeah.
I'm at the Center for Science Policy, and I was sort of you putting a satellite up as a research group, and it's a bit worrying, maybe that kind of individualistic if we're all sending up satellites. So is there something that policymakers on a national, international level should be doing, working in collaboration with academics?
Yeah, we wouldn't be doing it on our own. So we'd be partnering with like European Centre for Medium Range Weather Forecasting, the Met Office.
Parker's Piece. We should launch from Parker's Piece.
So I totally agree. It needs to be thought through, but yeah, the great thing is it's not within the realms of possibility now, right? 50K to 100K, you can start, launching satellites, and that's not a huge academic grant.
Oh, I was just going to also respond to that, like more broadly. I think this question of cooperation alongside decentralization, like how can we have both of those things? How can we create infrastructures that are resilient and ideally like including local values and sort of like decentralized priorities, but also allowing for collective and collaborative action across jurisdictions or across like research groups whatever it may be, is like is a tricky problem, but I think a really important one to grapple with as a community. Yeah.
I just wanted to build on Millie's point. We already have an example of this. The internet itself does not have a central controller. It is decentralized. It's got tons and tons of national agency. It's been probably humanity's most successful communications experiment, since World War II. So we do have templates on which we can build to make this stuff work. It's not like we're starting from scratch, but we have to make sure we learn the lessons from those things about, and we've seen downsides like misinformation and all of this stuff going on at the moment. So I think taking a step back and understanding what is the nature of the bilateral links we're making. Don't just get overly multilateral with a few big organizations like NATO, and then I think we have a good chance of fixing this. But we do need to think of this holistically and not just individuals launching for Marcus Peace. Fun that would be, but there is something in between which is quite practical. I could tell you what we were chatting about just before. So take Millie's species distribution models, take Richard's Aurora Earth Foundation models, take my biodiversity maps and stuff, and then try to figure out where can we do real species predictions, but also their reactions to extreme weather events and so on, and direct conservation actions that would happen immediately as more and more countries are exposed to extreme weather events. That's an example of taking three kind of open data sets and then trying to combine them together into a useful downstream task, which is short-term reaction to adverse events.
Yeah, I guess like building off of that a little bit, I've been thinking a lot about like devising strategies for implementing policies that I mentioned, and really specifically about the EU's nature restoration regulation. So like, where do we invest in restoration, and what might be the impacts of that investment, again, on species? Can we try to understand, like, if we restore this area to a wetland, how species might respond, and how much land-based climate mitigation that might provide, and how does that all play out in the context of a changing climate? And so I think that there's a lot in that space of like, can we actually come up with strategies for these long horizon policies that are taking into consideration like a huge amount of dynamics that are happening in these systems?
Yeah, so I guess we've been thinking a lot about using these AI models as like connective tissue to build together sort of end-to-end models. So currently in weather prediction or even climate models, you develop a physical model for one component, a physical model for another component. You maybe connect that into a hydrology model or a model for a city or infrastructure. And what the AI systems allow you to do is to arrange all of those data sets together and then train an end-to-end system that's going, straight, in our case, from satellite data and weather stations and data from ships and planes in real time, taking that through to forecasts at particular locations which are connected to the movement of people, to public health, to disease, to floods, like we talked about, atmospheric chemistry that will deal with air quality. 2 million people will die a year in India of adverse air quality events. And you can start to build this like very integrated set of like geospatial data sets which are all aligned, and then jointly training a model that can go end to end over the entire lot. So I think the great vision here is that AI can then come up with this much more integrated, holistic view of the world by integrating social media data in Ghana, where people go out and take photographs of the local reservoirs and of like how the crops are looking, and integrating that and type and talk about it. You can pull that kind of system into a weather prediction system, which the current physical approach just cannot do. So yeah, it all comes from the data, getting the data aligned, getting it out there, and then being brave and taking it on, I think.
Great. Well, I thought that was a great, inspiring point at which to bring this panel to a close. I think we've learned a lot about the uses that data science, AI, machine learning can be put to, some of the big challenges around where the data is coming from, the biases of where those data come from, and what the opportunities are to do better, but all the time thinking about who's curating that, what the infrastructure is, how open and resilient it is, but then ending on a really inspiring note about the real value